Yeah. 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 Okay.
Hello, welcome to Afrospace with me, Hadithi and my co-host, Inyasha Grace. Afrospace is a weekly show that brings you news about Africa. We focus on politics, economics, and as business, as well as culture and other attributes of this great African continent. Today, we have a gentleman that we are interviewing. His name is Lazola Belle. And Lazola Belle is a man of many parts, and I'll read his profile to you. He's a thought leader, public speaker, master of ceremonies, facilitator. He's the founder and executive member of SIT Investment Club. He's also the founder and strategic consultant at Epiphany Consulting. He's also a training manager and facilitator of Velisa Africa Academy. And his latest project, Hadithi, Africa, which is the story of Africa, is basically a project that he does with other team members, with all the knowledge he could use to advance development. And also he believes he travels a lot around the continent to be able to get a sense of how Africa can be interconnected from a trade perspective. And one of his ambitions is to travel the whole 55 countries in the next couple of years. Welcome to Afrospace, Lazola Belle.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Hadithi, and thank you for having me on a platform, and welcome to your listeners as well, or your watchers, viewers.
All right. So today, Lazola, we are going to be focusing on Ethiopia and getting a sense of understanding on what's happening in the country from an economic point of view, as well as obviously talking about something that's been heated in the news and press about the current squabbles that are going on over the Nile. So my first question is perhaps for you to give us a bit of understanding of the Ethiopian economy. It is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, and it is also the second most populous country in Africa after Nigeria, with over 100 million inhabitants. And we know that it is also the second largest economy in Africa. Can you help us understand exactly what are the drivers of the Ethiopian economy?
Thank you, Inyasha, for that question. I think even globally, I think Ethiopia is one of the top growing economies, and it's very interesting to watch their growth in the last couple of years. So I think at this point, what it's trying to do is to position itself as a mixed use, sort of mixed economy. But without a doubt, their recent industrial activity is the biggest driver of the economy. And of course, it's driven by a number of inputs, some foreign direct investment coming in from China, but also some local capacity. I think what the government has done very well in capacity building is the focus on the key enablers of the economy. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. In 2017, I was connecting to Tanzania and I flew via Addis Ababa. And so I didn't enter the country, but just in the descent, and I was looking at all the cranes and what is happening in the city, including Belle International Airport, where we landed. It was no doubt that what they've done in Africa, even to other regions, so that we get curious about Ethiopia. It is no surprise then that soon after that I visited Ethiopia specifically. But just to mention some of the key projects that I think have added to this development. Ethiopian Air in 2018 surpassed Emirates as the biggest connector of African traffic. Now that is huge if you consider how much Emirates has invested in connecting global traffic. So if you are able to beat Emirates in any way, you are a serious player in the world in terms of aviation. But if you look at other projects such as the rail systems that have put in place, you've got the 2015 metro, which was touted to be the first of such kind in sub-Saharan Africa. Huge capacity building in terms of infrastructure development from a government point of view, and also enabling the locals. You've also got the rail link that is going from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, which connects them further into the port of Djibouti, but also specifically also reminding the two nations of their relations and to strengthening that in 2018. What all of this means for Ethiopia in terms of its economy is that there's a lot of confidence that they are imparting within the domestic population, but of course within the onlookers in the world, to say something is working in Ethiopia and they are making the right moves in stimulating that economy. Of course, you've got the big elephant in the room, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which we're going to talk about more, which is a huge infrastructure program that is going to bring even more economic benefit to Ethiopia through its electricity production, as well as other spin-off industries. This is something, again, that will Ethiopia to really take care of its 100 million done through all those initiatives is huge for the country. The African Union being headquartered there is not, obviously, is helping as well, because it generates a lot more traffic into the country and a lot more interest and a lot more understanding of the cultures there. So I think those are some of the things that have boosted the economy in the last couple of years.
Okay. Look, I wanted you to, the question that I want to pose to you now, Lazola, is really around the etymology of Ethiopia. I mean, you don't arrive at 100 million more people population without huge diversity, especially in Africa. Countries that have huge populations like Nigeria and so on, they tend to have diversity of ethnicity. Now in Ethiopia, you have about 80 ethnic groups, and the Oromos are the largest group at 34%, the Amaras 27%, the Somali 6.1%, the Tigrayan are 6%, and the Sidama 2%. So these five groups are contributing about 75% of the population. There are other groups, of course, another maybe 75 ethnic groups, but these are the major ones. And of course, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is Oromo, the first Oromo to lead the country in its history. And now we've seen tensions that have happened with the murder or the killing of the young musician called Achalu Ndesa. As a result of that killing, there's been massive protests in the country. There's been a lot of attacks, you know, back and forth. More than 230 people have died, even though the international community has not really picked it up so much because of COVID and all of that. Can you please tell us, Lazola, give us a sense of these ethnic cleavages? Because I see it as almost, you know, it's an underbelly, if you like. It's a time bomb, a ticking time bomb, particularly the tensions between the Oromos and the Amaras. Can you just give us a sense of what's going on?
Thank you, TG, for that question. And I like that we are talking about it, because I think it's so important for us as Africans to really start to debate and discuss this. Ethiopia is not like any other African countries. In fact, other sources say that it was never colonized. I mean, there was a small Italian occupation with they fought off. So in other countries, the tensions of ethnicities are well documented because they are linked to colonization and post-colonization. In Ethiopia, on the other hand, because there's not such a big colonization history with time. So what we're finding in the center of the Ethiopian dynamics from an ethnicity point of view and from a politics point of view is that if you look back to some of the history, the Oromo were Addis Ababa sits on, and of course other lands in in the country is traditionally what they recognize as being their land, and have over that land. And there's some disheartenment of having been pushed out of that land as the city has been extended over the years. So that's something that is quite interesting. Some sources obviously put the Oromo ethnic group to be almost interesting that Prime Minister Abiy, they're getting some kind of representation. There is obviously that discontentness that the Amara, particularly tribe, has been fending on. What I want us to also maybe think about is that while Ethiopia's economy is booming, there is still many social issues there. And what happens with big ethnic groups is that they will feel those social issues the most. So if there's issues around poverty, of course, if you took absolute numbers, you will find that the Oromos are the most disenfranchised. And so when you look at that, the Omoros then are starting to look to view that as we're not being cared for. And these tensions then continue to tighten and tighten and tighten between the ethnic groups. Although largely they would be peaceful amongst each other, there's definite tension. One thing that I think was positive is when Prime Minister Abiy was elected, there was a sense that we've got the first Oromo in high office. He will then address some of the issues that we've had over the years. And of course, I think in his heart, he might really want to be addressing those issues. But when you think about politics and the ruling party in Ethiopia and how it operates and how government operates, it's easier said than done. And so now, so many years down the line, the Omoros are feeling like, even with our own people in power, we're still not getting the kind of reform, the kind of recognition that we need. And they're getting really, really, really disenfranchised. Of course, blaming the government of quashing opposition, arresting people that are talking badly about the government. So that tension continues to exist between the Oromos and the Aramas particularly. And of course, there's other smaller groups. So the killing of the musician obviously is a tipping point because you are such a powerful activist for the Oromos. So it just tips the scale and the violence erupts and everything goes into chaos. It's highlighting how tense those relationships are. And I think Prime Minister Abiy has got a huge task in his hand to really deliver some kind of economic relief, some kind of resonance to the Oromos, so that they believe that they are now being recognized as part of Ethiopia. They are now being addressed in terms of what they've been fighting for. So I think that's where the biggest challenge domestically is for Prime Minister, and it puts a lot of pressure on him, as you can see when we talk about other challenges that infrastructurally Ethiopia is facing, for him to deliver on that. The politics in Ethiopia are obviously not so much different to any other African country. In fact, now thinking back, when I visited Ethiopia last year in June, when I landed, the first thing I noticed was that the internet was switched off in the entire country. There was, from what I understand, details, but then I didn't link any ethnicity and other dynamics. But looking back, you start to pick up the ethnic diversity that is there, the political landscape, and of course, the tensions that continue to exist in that space. The government does tend to be heavy-handed in that the moment there's some kind of unrest, they switch off the internet instead of maybe listening to the people, and that does leave a huge, big bad taste in the population, in them trusting that the government are there to represent their interest. So I think that's where we are in terms of those tensions. They date back to Menelik II, and they continue to persist because the Oromos don't feel like, as a very big population in the country, they are being prioritized.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lazola. I'm going to take us to the Nile and help us here understand. We are aware that the Nile river basin contains about 10% of Africa's land mass, with 11 countries. And could you give us an understanding of some of those countries, which of those countries are part of that? And also show us as well the level of dependency that the river has on some of the nations, particularly if you can highlight Egypt and Ethiopia as they, tussle out over the Nile at the present moment?
All right. You know, I think my curiosity with the Nile started, I think it was 2018, I was in Uganda, and I was in this little town called Jinja. We're visiting the Victoria Lake, essentially where the Nile River starts to flow north to Egypt. And one of the things that we were visiting there is a point where it's called the source of the Nile. It's called the Nile Zero, and you see the water bubbling there. Fascinating experience. And when you're sitting on that little boat and observing just the vastness of the lake, so I made a comment to our tour guide and said, look, I think Uganda must obviously be having abundance of water, and you've got all this water to irrigate, you've got all this water to use. And then he quickly highlighted the various treaties that have been signed over the years, particularly the 1959 treaty, that actually bars Uganda of using the Nile water, which was bizarre to me. Essentially, that treaty allows Sudan and Egypt as the sole countries that can use the Nile water, which is quite fascinating when you consider that the basin involves all those 11 countries. Just to go through them, you've got Uganda, Kenya. So Uganda is also able to access other waters. Burundi and Rwanda are also not heavily dependent on that particular flow of the Nile towards the Mediterranean. The countries that are at the center of existential experience when it comes to the Nile is obviously Sudan and Egypt traditionally. And what is happening now with Ethiopia is saying, hang on, we also have an existential need for the Nile. And they've then said, look, what we want to do is we want to provide power, electricity to our growing population, to put 90% of the people in the grid. So we're going to build a huge infrastructure project, which is the Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, in order for us to provide the level of hydropower that we need. The problem with that, it started when Egypt looked at the fact that 90% or 80% of the water that gets deposited into their water system flows specifically from the Blue Nile. And so the worry then was that if the Blue Nile in one way or the other is disrupted, they will start having some water shortages going up to their reservoirs. Of course, Sudan, in the center of that water system, has also got the White Nile, which might still deposit some water to them, even if the Blue Nile is disrupted. But of course, it's catastrophic for Egypt. If I can just talk about Egypt, Egypt is not a small country, but Cairo is. So they're very congested because of water sources. And so if that water source in one way or the other is completely disrupted, it will spell carnage for Egypt. Of course, they're saying that a 2% drop in that water deposit, it affects about 1 million people of their population. So of course, Egypt is very nervous about the construction that is happening in Ethiopia, to extend that they've obviously touted words around military combat to really protect their space. There's obviously legal connections to the treaties that are in place, which allow them that water usage. But I think it's quite a serious dependence on them. It's completely, the entire economy relies on that flow of water. And so that's why it becomes such a touchy subject when you talk about the Nile to Egypt. To summarize on this, when you look at Ethiopia needs to feed a growing population, both in food and both in power. And of course, they need to drive the economic development, and they're looking at exporting some of that power they could generate there. And so for them, the Renaissance Dam building is not only a matter of creating life, but it's also to create confidence. It's also to really drive so much for the country. I think for Abiy as the Prime Minister, it's one of the key projects that he would hope to use to restore the relations that are weighing between him and his Oromo tribe. So they really need that project to go through. They've also funded it domestically through government bonds as well as private sector funding. So it's a it's a source of huge national pride. And so they've put a lot at the center of the Nile is Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And if they cannot reach an understanding about the journey forward, those tensions are continuously going to grow, and we're going to have some really bad spats in those countries, which we hope could work much closer together, because they essentially control such an important water source to the entire continent. I think just around.
Okay. Ethiopia and Egypt, Mr. Belle, Ethiopia and Egypt may go to war over the problems around the Nile in terms of the usage, water, all of that for the economies of both countries. They're likely to go to war. Now, the African Union had talks that included Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And again, those talks have come to a deadlock over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that the Ethiopians want to build. Egypt doesn't want them to do so. Now, from your very good vantage point, as it can be done to resolve this impasse between these two big African, if you like, economic and population giants?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is to understand what has already been achieved in terms of the solutions. I think for now, Ethiopia is saying in 3 years, Egypt has raised, and of course, Egypt has countered that to say, no. We need a flooding period of 12 years to 21 years, to which obviously Ethiopia now is saying, hang on, no, that's too long for us. Remember, we need this pinch point that we need to solve is that Crisis Watch has already come out to say, look, the problem that is a sticking point here is what happens when there's a drought. That's really what makes Egypt so nervous. And they've said that under normal circumstances, even if Ethiopia floods in 5 years, there won't be a huge impact on Egypt because the Aswan Dam, that is for purposes. You also put the dam in Sudan that is also upstream from the Renaissance Dam that can also keep that water flowing while it takes some of the tributaries from the White Nile. So they've looked at it and said, that can be done. And then we can find a balance of when the droughts are happening. The other key thing is that the Renaissance Dam, as it is now, is a non-consumptive dam. So it won't consume the water. It will actually generate power and flow it downstream. So it's easier from Ethiopia's understanding that if there's issues downstream, they can open the floodgates to push some of the water up so that Egypt and Sudan are not massively impacted. Of course, this still makes Egypt very nervous. And I think what becomes a huge political standoff, which generates the talk of war, which is obviously undesirable for both nations, certainly undesirable for the continent and for the world. Certainly the US being allies to both countries, they don't want to see that happening. The issue is that the 1959 treaty specifically still gives legal right for Egypt to have dominance over the Nile. And they are of the opinion then that if they not approve the building and the flooding of the Blue Nile Renaissance Dam, then there is a contravention legally there. I think then the biggest solution that we need to look at here to end this standoff is not to look at it as currently the world is looking at it through the trilateral discussions between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, but it's rather to look at it from inviting all the 11 countries that are part of the basin and to come to a process that disregards the 1959 treaty and comes up with a new kind of understanding of how to use the water fairly without compromising one economy over the other. Because as you can imagine, if there's a solution now that satisfies Ethiopia and satisfies Egypt, a few years down the line, Uganda might say, look, I want to erect a dam on the White Nile, and that threatens Sudan. And then we're back to square one because we're not solving the problem sustainably. And I think that's where the big diplomatic demand is. And of course, the two leaders and the far extremes, which is the leader of Egypt and Ethiopia, are under pressure domestically not to concede on their demands on this. And certainly for Abiy, if he concedes on the Renaissance Dam, he's risking again his hold in terms of his party politics and his ethnic group. So this becomes a huge thing. So the big solution for me is to really have a diplomatic solution between the 11 countries in the basin, to then start to say, how do we make sure that Egypt does not lose its reliance on the water, within their own sovereignty, develop projects along the water that benefit their economies. Of course, they stand to benefit from the Renaissance Dam in the excess power they will be getting from Ethiopia. At the same time, they're thinking that if it goes to combat, the Renaissance Dam is on their border, and they contend with the two within the 5 or the 11 nations that are at the basin. Hopefully, the AU can come in there and really mediate that and come up with a new treaty that completely disregards the 1959 treaty that allows fair usage of all countries and then fostering a stronger working together of those countries over those waters. Because those waters are not only important to Egypt, not only important to Sudan or Ethiopia, they're important to every country in the basin, whether they are on the surface or not. And every now and then, over the years, there will be flarings around accessibility to that water for irrigation and drinking and other purposes. So I think that's where we need to start solving this problem.
Okay, all right. Well, that's an interesting solution that you proposed there, Lazola. My next question, just interrogating the economy of Ethiopia a little further. Ethiopia has been described as a small country with a closed economy, much in the same manner that possibly China is also described, but as a big country with a closed economy. Would you say that statement is true?
I think it might have been true a few years ago. I think a lot of opening up of that economy of some of the private infrastructure that's going up, and even the government infrastructure. So I think Ethiopia, by virtue of the historical time, but then right now where we're going in terms of the African continent and the African Union, it needs to be opened up. And so it's done well in opening up by focusing on key infrastructure that enables the country. So I think most of us are still seeing as a closed economy, we're getting left behind. By the time we wake up that it's been an inviting economy, countries like, obviously, China would have entrenched their dominance within that, that economy. So I want to say it is not a small economy to begin with. Secondly, it is not closed. Yes, it's largely misunderstood from other African countries in terms of doing business there, and it's not as there's a lot of positive trajectory in that space. So I think the economy itself is quite open. It will only open up as they try to reinvigorate their manufacturing, and it's obviously opened up the transport sector into business before we lose that that space to other international players.
Okay. Lazola, which the questions that I have now are double barrel questions, and we'll be wrapping up after that. So I know Dangote is also there, South African company, and there, but also maybe that dovetails with what you talked about in terms of their infrastructure designs, in terms of building capacity around infrastructure. I do know that there are no retail outlets from South Africa, like your ShopRites and so on. They're not there. But the question I wanted to pose to you, first question is, in what is Ethiopia's competitive economic sort of lens, which sector or company, and you may have alluded to it in one of the answers you gave before, which sector or company in Ethiopia is, in your view, very successful, or the most successful that we can say this is a symbol of Ethiopian success? So those two questions for you as a final question.
I think domestically, just to start with the second question, you definitely see the retail sector that is tailored for from Ethiopia. It's a lot of brands when I was there that obviously I've never seen before, that you can start to see that they're quite dominant. But I think one of the biggest exports, which links back to your first question about why it's got a competitive advantage of a country, to say like Nigeria, is what the Ethiopian government or Ethiopians in general have done is they've said, well, how do we reform this economy? And then they've obviously had a list of sectors to target. And then they said, what do we start, right? And so one of the things they've done well is to create a very strong flag carrier. That Ethiopian airline, it is so powerful for that economy. And I know that people think, well, it's just flying around, what about the marginalized population? But actually, when you're in Ethiopia, you start to see how much it precipitates into the economy through its aviation school, through its hotels, through its other sectors that is starting to play in. And what it does, it goes out into the world and we become aware of it. And so we start to trust it. And so when we come into Ethiopia, we trust everything associated with it. And it's done very well to associate Ethiopia with that national carrier. So I think that's one huge advantage they've built over a lot of African countries. If I compare Nigeria, we know that Nigeria's got a huge population, so it makes business sense to have operations in Nigeria. But also, they've even consolidated their identity as what is Nigeria. And what we generally see with Nigeria is that there's a lot of industries that make a lot of money, oil and gas, but they're also linked to individuals as opposed to linked to the economy or the government. And of course, there's still legacy issues of colonization that are still precipitating in an economy like Nigeria. So what I would say is that Nigeria can focus on enabling infrastructure, rail, transport, national carrier, and they can maybe replicate what Ethiopia has done to become the hub of transportation in West Africa. I think that would be huge in cementing Nigeria's role in the continent, because that's what we're looking for from an economic point of view. What is your role? And I think with everything else that Ethiopia is doing, it's undoubtable right now in the continent that Ethiopia's role is to fly us around. And once we've made peace with that, we're able to interact with them further in other economies, sectors. Of course, cement is an obvious space to enter there because there's a lot of construction in Ethiopia, a lot of half-finished buildings that are going up. So Dangote would have to obviously move there, PPC would have to move there. But then we're also looking at once those hotels and all those things are built, there's a capacity to need, there's a training that we perhaps need from other cultures or other economies to come and influence that space. So do they have those kind of skills, and what can we bring in there? Consultancy work is also required there, and I think a country like South Africa should be playing a pivotal role in providing consultancy services into Ethiopia. Banking, remember in 2014, the first ATM was opened in Ethiopia, which surprised a lot of people because in a lot of countries, ATMs are forgotten when they came around. So it means that their banking sector is accelerating, and so they need some insight from mature banking sectors like South Africa and other areas in the continent. So there's a lot of sectors there. Of course, manufacturing, of course, food is a huge sector because that's a huge population, is growing, which is why, when we go back to the water solution, we have to think of it beyond just hydropower for the Rensas Dam. Because at some point, Ethiopia might say, hey, we want to use some of the flooded water for irrigation, and what does it mean for Egypt? So we have to look at those kind of solutions, but I think those are the key sectors that I can think of now and the influences and the advantages that the country has over other economies.
Just to add to you before we round up, just to add to what you said, some Nigerians might disagree with you that we don't have a clear advantage in some areas. So let me just remind you what they are. So it's the Nollywood. It's not huge like oil and gas, but huge competitive advantage over any country in Africa by far. Also the Nigerian music industry, which is massive. I mean, the Davidos, the Banks, and the Wizkids, and Burna Boy, huge prospects for the future, and a lot of collaboration, as you can see, with other parts of the continent. But also another area that people don't talk about is human capital. You mentioned it, but Nigerian diaspora contributes $23 billion every year. And the only other country that does more is Egypt. And the country that comes third is Ghana, with only about $3 billion. So I just thought I should add that to it, that sometimes people don't notice. They think everything is about big industry. So that's that. With those words, Nyasha, you wanted to comment? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I think
carry on.
Really, yeah, I think it's really, I think my job is to just thank you, Lazola, for coming and enlightening us very articulately on the issues around Ethiopian economy, and just, and the passion that you have for the continent, and just raising awareness about the issues that are happening on that side of the continent. And of course, I think we kind of talked about this before we came onto the show, that we need to generate more interest in us Africans to be knowledgeable about what's happening on the continent, about other countries, not just for, for business purposes, but just so we are aware, because here at Afrospace, we do say that we are one Africa because we are one people. And I think that's very important. And thank you so much for coming and just sharing that spirit with us here on Afrospace this afternoon.
So with those words, and thank you, Lazola would say, in Yoruba, it's Odabo, in Igbo, it's Kachifo, and in Hausa, it's Tegobe.
Well, in isiXhosa, my home language, is Siyabulela Enkosi. In Izulu is Siyabonga. In Sesotho, Realeboha. And in Afrikaans is Dankibaya.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
All right, and from me, Nyasha Grace, and Shona, we say Sarai Jaganaka. And in Swahili, it is Kwaheri. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.